Hello, and welcome to another session of our Lenten Bible study, Wandering in the Wilderness. We're going to actually do something really interesting here through our last week, which is to take what we've learned about Israel and the Exodus experience and their wilderness wanderings and move that forward in time to Jesus' temptations. We're going to be reading this week from Matthew chapter 4. This is kind of, we're preparing here for Holy Week, and we want to kind of make that connection. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, that time that Moses went up the mountain, and during which they built the golden calf. That was 40 days and 40 nights, and that is exactly what we hear, that time that Jesus spent in the wilderness. So he's preparing for his ministry. He's kind of getting ready to do what God has called him to do. He's being tested. He's seeing where that obedience will come in. So let's jump in and read from Matthew chapter 4 and see what we can learn.
All right, so Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So we notice that our first temptation that Jesus experiences in this time where he's forced out into the wilderness is about bread. It's about fulfilling basic needs. They said that he was there for 40 days and 40 nights and fasted during that time. So obviously the man is hungry. So again, the first level of temptation hits us at basic needs. Now, if you remember, as the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, as Moses was leading them through after they had been freed from Pharaoh and from Egypt, what did they need first? They needed the basics. After a few days, they grumbled because they didn't have water, and a few days more, they needed bread. So the first level of temptation for us, probably just as humans, we need those basic needs met. And so here, Jesus is being tempted with those. And the tempter says, hey, you're the Son of God. You can do absolutely anything. There's nothing you need to be worried about doing. If you're hungry, turn those stones into bread. So we see where the first level of temptation is for our basic needs. Now, this passage references Deuteronomy 8.
Mm-hmm. And just so we can kind of get to this place, Deuteronomy itself is kind of Moses' final sermon to the people. They're about to cross over into the Promised Land. That time of wilderness wandering is over when we get to Deuteronomy. But Moses says, wait. We need to talk one more time about what God expects. We need to talk through what you've experienced through the wilderness before we come to that land that God has promised. So when Jesus answers Satan here, he answers with the words from Deuteronomy 8. I'm going to read for you verses 1 through 5 and verse 10. The entire commandment I command you today, you must diligently observe, so that you may live and increase and go in and occupy the land that the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger, then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The clothes on your back did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplines you. You shall eat your fill and bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. So you see here, the lesson that we get in the wilderness for Israel is that they needed to learn that they could rely on God for provisions. When Jesus answers Satan, he says, this is the truth. I don't need to do this because I trust that God will provide. I trust that God has taken care of me. I can trust that during this time where I've been trying to prepare for ministry, during this time where I've been tested, during this time where I've tried to grow closer to God, I know that God will provide for me. I don't need to be worried. I don't need to be concerned. God is taking care of me just as he took care of Israel in the wilderness.
And that makes us think, where does this temptation come up later in Jesus' ministry? And that made us think about John 6, again, where the people are wanting bread. They're wanting basic sustenance, and Jesus says there could be so much more. But let's remember that passage from John 6. I'm going to read some select verses. Verse 15 says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. This is after he fed the people when they were needing food, and they used what they had, and there were still leftovers, and the people were amazed at the abundance. But Jesus is wanting them to go further than this, so we need to go beyond that. So let's look at verses 25 through 27. So remember, Jesus disappeared from them for a little bit. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, I will tell you the truth. You are looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. So again, you need more than just bread. And this is John 6 is finding another way of saying that to us. Let's look how this passage goes on a little bit further. Verses 30 to 35. So they asked him, what miraculous sign, then, will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our forefathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Now Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, from now on give us only this bread. And then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. And again, the people who are following Jesus know about the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, just as you and I do. And they're looking to this and going, okay, well, they got bread from heaven. They got the great stuff. They saw a miraculous sign. They were provided. So they know basic levels of that. And they're seeing where that's connecting when they needed food. And Jesus said, here. And there was more than enough from what was very little, what was perceived to be very little. There was plenty of for everyone. But the people are just fascinated with the magic, the miraculous. They need to go deeper. They need to see what else is there. And Jesus said, now it wasn't Moses who miraculously came up with this bread that the Israelites ate in the wilderness. God sent it. It needs to always point back to this God who provides. And the people ask for, really? Can we believe it? How are we supposed to know? The Israelites questioned it that way. The people following Jesus questioned it that way. And if we are honest, we know that we question it that way. God, what sign will you provide? What miracle will you send to me now? How can I trust your provision? That is the question, friends. How can we trust in God's provision? And as we head into Holy Week and we think about the ways in which Jesus was tempted, we realize that we experience those same temptations. We need to look and see how, not just how Jesus made it through, because Jesus also being Son of God, he had a bit of the divine in him to be able to get through those temptations. But Jesus can help point us to see that our belief in Jesus means that we can believe in God's provisions, that we can believe that that what we need is right here for us. And that we need to be thankful that God does provide those things. Just think about all the things that Deuteronomy 8 was reminding the Israelites of. Remember how you didn't go hungry. Remember how your clothes didn't get holes in it. Your feet didn't swell. So many things God provided for their needs. But they didn't always remember to thank. They didn't always remember to count on it. We need to learn that lesson. Maybe it's true with what you may have been tempted with during the season of Lent, in small ways and even big ways. Did you remember to thank God for those provisions all the way through? Did you remember to see God in those provisions as they met your needs all the way through this season? I think this brings us to bigger questions and bigger ways that we are going to dive deeper into this passage where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. So stay tuned for 2 more episodes this week. But as I say that, since this is our last week of our Lenten Bible study, I want to put out a call one more time. Write in the comments. Do you have any questions you want us to answer? Maybe we'll put in a bonus episode next week answering any of your questions. So go ahead, write them in. We'll do a question and answer episode next week. All right, we'll see you later this week.